It is just after 7 o'clock on the morning of 6 June 1944. The landing craft, a flat-bottomed steel box of a vessel, pitches violently in the gray swell of the English Channel. Through the salt spray and the diesel fumes, the coast of Normandy is visible now, a low line of pale sand fronted by a jumble of dark, twisted shapes. For the men huddled inside, their faces striped with camouflage cream and slick with seawater, those shapes are the first real evidence of the nightmare they have been told to expect. They are the obstacles, thousands of them, scaffolding of steel and timber tipped with teller mines powerful enough to rip the bottom out of a landing craft and turn 40 men into so much raw meat in the water. These are Rommel's asparagus, the field marshal's personal touch, designed to ensure the invasion died on the tide line before a single soldier could draw breath on French soil. But amongst the infantry in the bobbing craft, there are other men, men of the Royal Engineers, Sappers. They are not staring at the beach with the wide-eyed dread of the assault troops. They are checking their kit, running gloved hands over fuse assemblies and slabs of high explosive. They are looking at the obstacles not as instruments of their own destruction, but as a problem to be solved, and they have brought their own solution with them. It is not a sleek new fighter plane, nor a wonder weapon that will win the war in a single stroke. It is something far stranger, far more desperate. It is a 40-ton tank, stripped of its main gun and fitted with what looks like a massive, ugly mortar on its front. Its crew call it a flying dustbin. The Germans, when they see it, will have no name for it at all. It is the Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, the AVRE, and it is about to do something that looks utterly, suicidally mad. It is going to drive directly into that tangled mess of steel and mines and concrete, and it is going to clear a path with nothing more than brute force, raw courage, and a weapon designed to throw a 40-pound bomb the length of a football pitch. This is the story of that vehicle, and of the men who drove it into the mouth of hell. It is a story of British ingenuity under pressure, of thinking that was so far outside the box it seemed to some like insanity. And it is the reason that, by the end of that longest day, the British and Canadian beaches were not a slaughterhouse, but a gateway. To understand why the AVRE was necessary, one must first understand the scale of the problem it was designed to solve. The disaster at Dieppe in August 1942 had taught the Allies a brutal lesson. You could not simply steam into a French port and expect to capture it. The German defenses were too strong, the casualties too horrific. So the plan for the invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, would instead land on the open beaches of Normandy. But this created an even more difficult problem. How do you supply an army without a port? The Germans knew this as well as the Allies did. They had spent nearly 2 years fortifying the coastline of northwest Europe, and from 1942 onwards, the man in charge of making those defenses truly impenetrable was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He had seen firsthand in North Africa what Allied air power could do to his supply lines. He was determined that the invasion would be stopped on the sand. He famously declared, "The war will be won or lost on the beaches. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive." To ensure that decision went his way, he turned the shoreline into a nightmare of military engineering. By the spring of 1944, his men, the forced laborers of the organization taught, had planted millions of these obstacles. There were Element C, steel gates originally designed to block tanks, now welded into anti-invasion barriers. There were hedgehogs, 3 or 4 steel rails bolted together like the jack from a child's game, designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft. And there were the stakes, simply wooden poles driven into the sand at an angle pointing seaward, with a captured artillery shell or a purpose-built teller mine lashed to the top. The whole thing consumed 200,000 cubic meters of reinforced concrete a month at its peak. They were not just scattered randomly, they were laid in belts, in rows, in depth. A landing craft approaching the shore at high tide would smash into those just below the waterline. If it came in at low tide, as the planners intended, it would disgorge its men onto a beach still cluttered with these lethal devices, which the Germans could then sweep with machine gun and mortar fire. It was a kill box, meticulously designed. Existing solutions were inadequate. Standard military doctrine would have called for combat engineers, sappers, to go in with the first wave, armed with explosives to blow the obstacles apart by hand. But on a beach like Gold or Sword, under the muzzles of dug-in German 75mm and 88mm guns, this was not a job, it was a sentence of death. A man moving slowly in the wet sand, placing a heavy charge on a steel stake wrapped with barbed wire, is a stationary target. The casualty rates would have been appalling, and the momentum of the assault would have died with the engineers on the tide line. The Allies needed a way to get the sappers to the problem inside an armored shell. They needed a tank that was not a tank, but a Royal Engineer in 40 tons of steel. The man given the task of creating this impossible machine was a fiery, visionary general named Percy Hobart. Hobo, as he was known, was an armored warfare enthusiast who had been sidelined before the war for his radical ideas. But with the invasion looming, his talents were suddenly indispensable. He was given command of the 79th Armored Division, a formation with a unique mission. It would not fight as a division. Instead, it would become a holding pen, a workshop, a mad scientist's laboratory for every bizarre, specialized armored vehicle the invasion could possibly need. They became known, to the men who would use them and to the historians who would study them, as Hobart's Funnies. The most versatile, the most important, and arguably the ugliest of these funnies was the AVRE. The initials stand for Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers. It was based on the Churchill infantry tank, a British design that was slow, heavy, and not particularly well armed compared to the American Sherman. But the Churchill had one vital characteristic. It was exceptionally well armored and possessed superb climbing ability. It could crawl over shell craters and scale seawalls that would stop other vehicles dead. This made it the perfect platform for the job. Inside a factory in England, the standard Churchill was gutted. The powerful 6-pounder or 75mm gun was removed from the turret. In its place, the Royal Engineers, working with the designers, fitted something entirely different, a 290mm spigot mortar, officially known as the petard. This was not a conventional gun. A spigot mortar works by placing a bomb over a steel rod, the spigot, which fires a propellant charge down inside the bomb's tail, launching it forward. The bomb the AVRE fired was a drum-shaped canister weighing 18 kilograms, or roughly 40 pounds. The crew did not call it a mortar bomb, they called it the flying dustbin. It looked exactly like a metal dustbin, stubby and crude, packed with high explosive. When it hit a concrete pillbox or a reinforced wall, it didn't just punch a hole, it landed with a colossal, ground-shaking thump, designed to demolish fortifications through sheer blast. Its maximum range was only about 140 meters. This was not a weapon for long-range dueling. This was a weapon for getting right up in the enemy's face and knocking his front door down. But the petard had a terrifying flaw. To reload it, a crew member, often the gunner himself, had to open a small hatch on the front of the tank, reach out into the open air, and slot a new 40-pound bomb onto the spigot. Imagine the scene. Your tank is sitting 50 meters from a German machine gun nest. The air is thick with bullets and shrapnel. You have just fired your flying dustbin. Now you must physically expose yourself to enemy fire to reload. It was a job that required a very particular kind of courage, or perhaps a very particular kind of madness. Sapper Fred Williams, a gunner with the 80th Assault Squadron, Royal Engineers, remembered the feeling of being inside one of these machines as the coast of France loomed out of the dawn mist. "You can see the French coast now, lads," came the cry, he later recalled. "I wondered how the hell we were going to get through them." The petard was only one part of the AVRE's bizarre toolkit. These tanks were also designed to carry and deploy a range of other devices that looked less like military hardware and more like the props from a circus act. There was the bobbin, a huge reel of canvas reinforced with steel rods, 3 meters wide, carried on the front of the tank. When the AVRE drove onto soft sand or mud where vehicles would bog down, the crew could pay out the bobbin, laying a temporary roadway across the treacherous ground. There was the fasten, a massive bundle of brushwood or metal pipes, tightly bound together and carried on the front. When the tank came to a wide anti-tank ditch or a bomb crater, it could simply drop the fasten into the hole, creating an instant causeway to drive over. Sapper Williams's tank carried one of these, a huge wooden bundle that completely blocked his view from the driver's seat. There was even a small box girder bridge folded up on the tank's front that could be launched to span a gap of up to 30 feet. The Churchill AVRE was not a tank in the traditional sense. It was a mobile, armored toolbox, a mechanical sapper designed to solve any problem the beach could throw at it. If this vehicle looks to you like an act of desperate genius, you would not be wrong. By the time the first AVREs were being assembled, the clock was ticking down to the largest amphibious invasion in history. The production figures are staggering, even if the exact numbers are blurred by the secrecy of the time. Hundreds of Churchills were converted. They were built not just in tank factories, but in REME workshops, where fitters worked around the clock to waterproof every electrical connection, every engine component, to stop the salt water of the channel from killing the machines before they even reached the sand. If you are finding this story of ingenious British engineering interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It lets us keep telling these forgotten tales of the men and machines who changed history. So how did this strange, ugly vehicle compare to what the enemy or the Allies had? The Germans, for all their defensive prowess, had no equivalent to the AVRE. Their strategy was reactive. They built massive concrete fortifications and waited for the Allies to smash themselves against them. They had combat engineers, of course, the pioneering, but their role was to build obstacles, not to clear them under fire with armored vehicles. The closest the Germans came was the occasional use of obsolete tanks as mobile bunkers, but they had no coordinated program of specialized assault armor. Their philosophy was one of static defense, not dynamic engineering-led assault. The Americans, initially, were skeptical of Hobart's Funnies. They preferred to rely on the raw power of their infantry and the standard guns of their Sherman tanks. They believed that overwhelming force and personal bravery would be enough. They declined British offers of large numbers of these specialized vehicles for their own beaches. The result was Omaha. On that bloody stretch of sand, the American forces lacked the AVREs, the flail tanks for clearing mines, and the armored bulldozers in sufficient numbers. They were left to fight their way across the killing ground with their bare hands, and the cost was terrible. It's one of the great what-ifs of the war. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the Funnies were deployed in force. By the time the infantry landed, the AVREs and the mine-flailé Sherman crabs had been at work for crucial minutes, carving lanes through the obstacles and suppressing the defenders. The difference in casualty figures, though complex, tells its own stark story. The British and Canadian beaches, despite fierce resistance, were never the charnel house that Omaha became. The moment of truth arrived as the landing craft ramps dropped. The AVREs of the 79th Armored Division, along with the assault squadrons of Royal Engineers, rolled down into the surf and churned towards the sand. Sapper Williams's landing craft landed slightly off course, east of their target at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. The flail tank in front of them, a Sherman crab with its rotating drum of heavy chains beating the ground, did its job, clearing a path through the mines. But then the AVRE was faced with the seawall, a 16-foot-high concrete barrier. A leading tank, another AVRE, drove straight at it and used its petard, not to blast a hole, but simply to survive. It charged the slope, crashing down the other side with a 4-foot drop that would have destroyed a normal vehicle. The fasten on Williams's tank, intended for a bomb crater on the road to Caen, was instead used to help create an exit off the beach, dropped into a gap to solidify the route. On other sectors, AVREs fired their flying dustbins directly into the embrasures of German pillboxes. The effect was devastating. The concussion alone was enough to stun the defenders, and a direct hit could bring the whole structure down. One account tells of a party of engineers who, covered by their armored behemoths, were able to seize an important German installation before their defenders could demolish it. Another describes a bulldozer driver, protected by his blade, driving back and forth in front of a German strongpoint, pushing up earth to literally bury the enemy's firing slits alive, blinding them while the infantry worked around the flanks. The psychological impact on the German defenders must have been profound. They had prepared for an invasion of men. They were faced with a mechanical juggernaut. A standard German soldier armed with a rifle and a machine gun had no answer to a Churchill AVRE. Its frontal armor was impervious to his weapons. He could only watch as this monstrous thing crawled over his obstacles, dropped bridges into his ditches, and then, from a stubby mortar on its front, threw a 40-pound bomb that could collapse his concrete bunker around his ears. One Times correspondent, embedded with the 21st Army Group, described the sappers at work as imperturbable and indifferent to what was going on around them, as though on just another exercise, like true successors of those dauntless sappers who blew in the Kashmir Gate at the siege of Delhi. They were not indifferent, of course. They were terrified, but they had a job to do, and their machines gave them the one thing they needed most, a fighting chance. The Churchill AVRE was not a beautiful machine. It was slow, ugly, and its main weapon had to be reloaded by a man sticking his head out into a hurricane of bullets. By any conventional measure of military design, it should have been a death trap. But it worked. It worked because it was designed by men who understood that war is not a game of elegant equations, but a dirty, chaotic struggle where the only rule is to survive and complete your task. It was a vehicle born of a simple, desperate truth that on the morning of 6 June 1944, the best way to clear a beach obstacle was to send a tank to do it. And the tank that went, the tank that faced the ugliest, most deadly array of steel and concrete the enemy could devise, was not a fighter. It was a sapper. It was a British engineer in 40 tons of steel, and it cleared the way.